Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar from LRQA on how to implement an effective ISO 45001 Occupational Health and Safety Management System. My name is Louise Hollings and I'm one of the marketing managers at LRQA and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation and we will collect these and go through as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We'll also be running some polls today, and please note that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage on screen. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today. We have Martin Cottam, the Chair of ISO TC 283, Occupational Health and Safety Management. Martin is an engineering risk management specialist. He began his career in the nuclear industry, undertaking risk assessment and safety case preparation before joining Lloyd's Register. There, over almost 31 years, he undertook risk assessment and safety management projects across many major hazard industries and held a variety of roles, spending the last 6 years as Group Technical Assurance and Quality Director, with overall responsibility for quality management and technical governance across the organisation. He now provides independent occupational health and safety and quality management systems consultancy, covering strategy, governance and implementation. Martin has contributed to the development of several OHS standards, including OSAS 18001 and the ISO 55000 series on asset management. He chaired the BSI Mirror Committee throughout the development of ISO 45001, leading the UK delegation on the ISO 45001 Project Committee. He now chairs the ISO Technical Committee for Occupational Health and Safety Management, ISO TC 283, and is convener of the ISO Task Force on the Future of ISO Management System Standards. And our second speaker today is Bill Barnes, Auditor Manager at LRQA. Bill is an integrated senior lead assessor working with LRQA since 2005 and involved in ISO 9001, 14001, 45001 and responsible care audits. Bill has over 35 years of manufacturing engineering, consulting, training and assessment experience for quality, health and safety, environmental and security aspects in the service and manufacturing industries, working with organisations from shop floor through to management positions in industries including aerospace, chemicals, heavy industry, transportation, pulp and paper and the food and beverage sector. This includes addressing improvements for a wide range of workplace safety and process safety settings. Over the past few years, he has been heading LRQA thought leadership efforts for workplace safety through ISO 45001 and ISO 45003, psychosocial safety in the workplace. He's a licensed professional engineer, IRCA principal auditor, and Exemplar Global responsible care auditor. Welcome to you both. I'll now hand over to Martin, who will start today's presentation.
Thank you, Louise, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here for this session, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to begin with an introduction to the most recently published standard in the ISO 45000 family, ISO 45002, which provides guidance on implementing ISO 45001. In other words, it's addressing the very topic of our webinar today. Those of you involved over a long period with occupational health and safety management, I think will see the parallel immediately with the OSAS family of standards that preceded ISO 45000, where a guidance document, an implementation guidance document, OSAS 18002, was published, in fact, within about 12 months of the publication of the requirements specification, OSAS 18001. For a variety of reasons, it's taken a little longer to publish an implementation guide in this case, but we now have ISO 45002 published and available. It's a standard which offers implementation guidance applicable to all organisations. And when I say all organisations, I guess you'd naturally think of organisations of all sizes, of all types, and in all sectors, and of course that would be correct. But it's also, I think, equally applicable to organisations which are newly developing an occupational health and safety management system, and to organisations with a long-established occupational health and safety management system. And you might be a bit surprised to hear me emphasise the value of a document like this to organisations with a long-established system. Surely organisations like that have decided how to implement the requirements of the 45,001 standard a long time ago, and those processes are long established, so why would they need this guide? Well, I think one of the important messages of this session, about which Bill will be saying more later, is the fact that the world of work has been changing rapidly in recent years and shows every sign that it will continue to change rapidly throughout the coming decade. And that means, of course, that organisations are changing, and the way that they need to manage occupational health and safety is also continually changing. And so some of our established ways of meeting 45,001 requirements may need to be reevaluated and adapted over time, because of that, the fact that we're in a changing environment. Now, this standard complements an implementation handbook, which in fact our committee published very soon after the publication of ISO 45001 in 2018. That implementation handbook, the full title is there in the small print on the screen. That handbook was aimed particularly at an audience of smaller and medium-sized and micro organisations. It doesn't mean it isn't of value to other organisations, but it was written very much with that audience of smaller organisations in mind. And it's now that we've published the more general guidance. The advantage of the delay in doing so is that, unlike a document like OHSAS 18002, we can benefit from the experience of the 4 or so years of implementation of ISO 45001. And so this standard contains 48 real-life examples of how organisations have implemented the different requirements within ISO 45001. And those examples come from organisations of all different sizes and types and levels of complexity. And they illustrate the practical ways that those organisations have gone about implementing aspects of ISO 45001. And they cover all the different clauses, in other words, all the different parts of an OHS management system. So next slide, please. So having put some emphasis on the 48 examples, I'm going to go on to say they are only examples. That they do help to reinforce an important message, which is that organisations are free to use whatever arrangements they wish to meet the requirements of ISO 45001. You don't have to do it the same way as everybody else. But of course, it's sometimes useful not to have to entirely reinvent the wheel. And so this document, I think, can be useful to many organisations because they may see things which they can adopt or adapt. And of course, you're very much free to do that, but you're equally free to do something completely different if that feels more appropriate. So if the message here is that there are many ways that an organisation can meet the requirements of ISO 45001, and that we've got that freedom to choose how we go about doing it, I guess the question is, so how do we make those choices? In other words, what sort of things should we be considering in making that choice? And perhaps equally importantly, how do we know whether the choice that we've made is a good choice? Next slide, please. So I think in making those choices and achieving an effective and successful implementation of ISO 45001, there are some key words reflected on this slide which are really well worth bearing in mind. The first of those is context, and that's the word used in ISO 45001 itself to describe the environment in which the organization is operating, both the external environment and the environment within the organization itself. And in fact, we should also mention the requirements and expectations of stakeholders. So that overall environment is the context. And I think customizing a management system to an organization and making it effective is all about customizing it with a close eye to the particular context of the organization. So what do we mean by that? External factors could be economic, so the general economic situation, financial situation. It could be where the organization sits in a supply chain. It could be issues to do with the political environment, technology options, the sector, the geography in which the organization is operating, or geographies plural. Internal factors could be things like the products and the services which the organization delivers. Worker demographics, now that's an increasingly important one, I think, for many organizations to consider. The organization itself in terms of its values, objectives, its governance, its culture, perhaps its OHSMS history, an important thing to bear in mind. And then those interested party needs and expectations. So we're talking about workers, regulators, clients, suppliers, the public, of course, in some cases, neighboring facilities, whatever it may be. So context is a key word, I think, in trying to make those choices of how do we find the best way for our organization to meet the requirements of 45001. Proportionality is also really important. And that's about putting effort into the management system, making the management system deploy its efforts, the efforts of the people within the organization, in a way that's proportional to the risk and proportional to the benefits you're going to get from putting effort into that particular area in terms perhaps of risk reduction. And in other words, that's really about targeting your efforts very well, not doing more than is necessary. And I emphasize not doing more than is necessary, because I think particularly for organizations with long established systems, it's very easy for a management system to grow through the incremental addition of lots of things which seem like a good thing to do. But you can, if you're not careful, you can end up with a system which is over complex and becomes burdensome and is actually difficult for people to understand. And if they can't understand it, they're not likely to be very successful implementing it. So proportionality, I think, is key to really try and put in as much effort as is needed, but not more. And then the question is, of course, how do we know whether we've made the right choice in the way that we choose to implement particular requirements of the standard? And I think the key test here is effectiveness and not conformance. So it's not a question of going to the standard and saying, well, can I see whether I've done exactly what it says I should be doing for this particular process? Of course, that matters. But it's much more about the question of, is the process delivering the outcome, the end result, which it's intended to do? And actually that sounds very obvious, but sometimes I think in managing OHS, it's easy for organizations, I have this experience myself, to lose track perhaps of that bigger picture of, is this process working? Because we focus in on more local metrics about effectively, are the wheels turning on the process? So let me give you an example. We talk about things like incident investigation or corrective action. We're often in organizations very focused on the time cycle of, have the actions been completed? How long has it taken to complete actions? How many actions are outstanding? And so with investigation, we can be talking about the time to carry out the investigation, whether the investigation seems to have got to root causes, whether the actions have been implemented. But the ultimate test of all that process, of course, is does it stop similar incidents occurring in the future? And I've certainly had the experience of an organisation which hadn't for itself spotted the fact that the answer to that question was it's not stopping the recurrence. Those similar accidents are still happening. So all the actions were getting closed off and it looked very nice at that level. But the process itself was not effective. And in that case, of course, it's clear that if that's the case, the OHS management system simply isn't working. So I'll take the opportunity just to highlight that because this issue of measuring effectiveness is so important, the committee responsible for the 45,000 series of standards is just in the process, in fact, of producing a document specifically providing guidance on OHS performance evaluation. And we've just had a successful ballot of national standards bodies, which means we're pretty much on track, I think, to publish this document towards the end of this calendar year or very early in the first month or two of 2024. So I think that's probably where I should stop and hand over to Bill, but I hope that's given a sort of some key thoughts on how we go about making the choices which we're free to make in directing our efforts to make an effective OHS management system. Thank you. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Martin. I'm just going to step in before Bill gets started and ask our first poll question for today. So our first poll is, what is your organisation's biggest health and safety management challenge? And the options are workplace incidents and hazards, employee engagement and participation, emergency preparedness and response, psychological health and well-being, OHS performance evaluation. So those options again are workplace incidents and hazards, employee engagement or participation, emergency preparedness and response, psychological health and well-being, or OHS performance evaluation. Just give people a few more seconds to take part. So there's a standout challenge there. Martin and Bill, what do you make of that result?
I think it's a very interesting result, don't you, Bill? It kind of goes to the heart of the fact that one of the more significant areas emphasised in ISO 45001 is the need to have effective involvement and participation of workers, and that went a lot further than any previous OHS standard has done. But it's not easy to achieve, so it doesn't surprise me to see organisations seeing that as one of the bigger challenges, and maybe we'll be able to talk some more about ways of doing that in the course of this session. I think the one other surprise, though, for me, I'd say, is perhaps that the numbers on psychological health and well-being aren't a bit higher, because it's a topic which has been receiving a huge amount of attention, I would have said, in the sort of OHS press, for want of a better way of putting it, and the dialogue around OHS has been quite heavily skewed towards the weaknesses that many organisations perhaps historically had in being able to effectively address psychological health. So I'm a little bit surprised that isn't, a bit higher up on more people's radars.
Yeah, I agree, and we'll actually talk a bit about some of these new ways in which we should consider engaging employees and participating in the workplace, and some of the new dynamics, individual and social expectations. That doesn't surprise me that the employee engagement participation does bubble up, and everybody's exploring or inquiring about new ways to succeed, and that's going to be a big part of what I've got coming up here in a few minutes. Certainly then on the psychological health and well-being, yeah, I think that the opportunity to learn and understand what that really means, as Louise had mentioned, I explore a lot of the 45,003 standard, but beyond that, there's a lot of learning to understand what a neurodivergent community workforce is and how different people tick. And there's a lot of breaking science and a lot of breaking conversation and dialogue on that topic. It's understanding how people tick and how do you engage with them, and the dynamics there are changing. So I just see that one as spinning up in the not too distant future as a key element.
And it actually leads very well into our next poll question. So this one goes a bit deeper into that area of psychological health and well-being. And so we're curious to find out about your awareness of and interest in ISO 45003, which are the guidelines for managing psychosocial risks. So is your organisation considering implementing ISO 45003 within its OHS management system? And the options there are yes, we're thinking about implementing ISO 45003 through our OHS management system, or we've already implemented ISO 45003, or we have other systems in place to manage psychosocial risk in the workplace. Do you want to learn more about this area, or is it something that you're not planning to implement currently? So just to run through those options again. Yes, we're thinking about implementing ISO 45003 through our OHS management system, or we already have implemented ISO 45003. We have other systems in place to manage psychosocial risk in the workplace. You want to learn more about this area, or you do not plan to implement ISO 45003 currently. Okay, thank you to everyone who voted. So it looks like an area where people are keen to learn more about this.
Well, I'm encouraged by that result, certainly, in the sense that it's good to see people taking an interest in it, isn't it, Bill? Because, when you look at the statistics on the costs to organisations of, poor occupational health and safety performance, in many cases, those costs these days are actually dominated by the costs associated with psychological ill health, aren't they, rather than physical ill health?
Yeah, and beyond that, there's the business implications. Companies are bringing in talent, and that talent doesn't always come in a clean pressed suit, so to speak, psychologically. But there is great talent out there, and to retain that talent to do the great many things that organizations are trying to do, whether it's on the shop floor, it's a design capacity, it's an administrative function. They've got to kind of work with who they have and can get great things out of it, because there's a lot of great talent. Like I said, if you explore the neurodivergent community, there's a lot of great people. And I think this interest is in this poll is how do we retain that talent equally as much as some of the dollars and cents injury and illness impact associated with people not being well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it's also worth us just saying these are not two separate compartments, are they? Which is sometimes the way they're presented. Physical health and safety and psychological interact one with the other. So actually, psychological, a lack of psychological well-being in the workplace can lead to more physical accidents taking place. So in fact, you can address both aspects of health and safety by focusing some more attention on psychological well-being too.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for taking part in these polls. We'll have one more just before the Q&A session. And as a reminder, you can submit questions at any point through the question pane in your attendee control panel. And we'll cover those in the Q&A session at the end. So we'll now hand over to Bill. He'll take you through how ISO 45002 can be used to address some of the most common issues found during certification audits. Bill, I think we're getting just a little bit of background noise. I think.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I think it's maybe just when you were moving. So.
Okay. Well, good day, everyone, and I hope it's been a safe one for you and for your organization. Thank you, Martin, for introducing the topic of the guidance document and so many of the things that are happening in the OHS risk management arena for all of us. I guess now that we've got your attention, let's explore the 45002 guidance standard. Obviously, the changing landscape for organizations we've talked about, seeking to manage the well-being of workforces requires fresh looks at all elements of workplace OHS management. Martin brought that point home quite clearly a few moments ago. So we will explore 3 clauses from the from the standard that LRQA has been seeing the most findings with, and examine the many new thoughts on how 45001 can be used to address workplace OHS risks, along with the new guidance in 45002 for planning your OHS management system for success. In fact, you can look at a white paper from LRQA from our recent study of OHS nonconformities that I believe is going to be in our handout section. So it was the premise for, let me take a look at a few clauses. What are your hot buttons? So let's start with context of the organization. Martin kind of got us started on a conversation about why that's important. You see a few bullets here. Certainly workforces have experienced increasing turnover, the changing needs and expectations of workforces and other interested parties in recent years, in part due to expectations in ESG reporting, among other things, from investors. There is a wide interest in workplace safety and the well-being of workers from the ESG standpoint, and a lot of the reporting goes on there. It all combines for a need to be adaptable quickly to workforce changes. Those workforces are changing, the interested parties' expectations are changing, they're changing rapidly. As Martin mentioned, it's been 4 years since the 45002 came out, but here we are. What a great opportunity we have even now, and probably if you look at some of those examples, and we'll take a peek at a few, there's new thought that goes into it. The examples probably would have been different had they been written in 2018. The world's gone through quite a bit since then, physically and psychologically. So, how we work and communicate continues to change across generations of workers and changing ethnic mixes in the workplace, the composition of our workforce. There are new expectations of work-life balance following the COVID pandemic that influences people's level of engagement in safety planning. Is their willingness to participate in safety committees or other safety roles? And they may be a challenge when many are not seeking to serve beyond minimal work duties. Define my job for me, and I will gladly complete that. When you start to define some of these additional expectations, tasks, voluntary roles, are people going to engage? That's a very good question. As the talent composition changes, and something that we look for when we're out in the field doing all of our certification audits, how healthy do safety committees and all these other processes we'll talk about, how well are they maintained? So certainly, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, are significant and serious elements of any workforce that can influence safety communications efforts. It's not so easy to be inclusive continually in everything that you put out there, everything that you communicate, whether it's written or spoken or shared in the many media that we now have. You know, there's a challenge to it, but there are many new ways in which organizations can engage and communicate across workforces, including new ways of learning thanks to technology. One example I think of is new online and blended training activities to embrace technologies such as Microsoft Teams, where quizzes and polls emerge, and there are new tools to allow for individually paced training delivery. We were talking about that before we went on air this morning of some of the new ways in which someone might, one of our listeners here might have downloaded this a week from now and had that opportunity when they can both hear and listen to the material and absorb it. You know, that's changing that landscape, and technology allows that. So certainly all these things have to be factored into, you know, what should we be doing with the context of our organizations. You know, some are glad to get back to face-to-face training in classrooms, but you know, that necessity during the pandemic to go to an electronic medium, I think we've changed the landscape permanently for delivery. So the 45,002 guidance, there's an example that's provided as a medium-sized manufacturer organizes brainstorming efforts to identify external and internal stakeholders in their context of the organization and their evolving expectations by including representation across the organization. So if you get a chance to take a look at the guidance document, take a look at that one and look at the approach that the sample organization took to engage their workforce. Think of some of these new influencers shown here in identifying traditional and unique interested parties, along with the scope of occupational health and safety risks that your organization wants to address, both physical and psychological, to protect worker well-being. So we encourage you to kind of embrace some of these things into that conversation and embrace your new and changing workforce in how they want to take that on. Next slide, please. So the next example that I wanted to take a look at with you is this whole notion of consultation and worker participation. Let's dive right into that subject that we've been kind of talking around a bit here throughout the presentation here. ISO 45001 set out to raise the bar on the involvement of workforces in creating, maintaining, and using OHS management systems. I always tell people with integrated management systems, it's the only one with 5.4. Everybody's supposed to have this 2015 Annex SL framework, but why does 45,001 have 5.4? Very important. And I think it's the example that other standards look towards, especially when we look at engaging the workforce in quality aspects. So let's focus in on workplace safety while we're here. As stated earlier, the landscape has changed, and even as basic as how you communicate to various groups or members within your workforce, it becomes very relevant now. identifying the many ways in which consultation and participation should occur, and then leveraging in new ways to communicate is demonstrated in the registers and examples offered by ISO 45002. There are some really good listings when you get into 5.4 of that guidance of examples of communication methodologies. Like I said, I think we all benefit that this thing is only recently published, and probably the list in that part has been rewritten many times over. I'm sure you can attest to that, Martin. And that one example from that guidance is great because it identified 13 different pathways in which that organization pursued to improve engagement of the workforce in many ambitions and many elements for their OHS management systems, from identifying risks to communicating operational controls to monitoring what they do. A great many examples. I encourage folks to really take some time to explore some of them. We've got an example coming up here in just a minute. Another example utilizes a matrix brainstorming of activities versus roles in the organization. So, the team in that example took this approach of a matrix of down the side and across the top, and what do we come up with, and try to fill all the boxes to brainstorm that team and come up with some neat things. I encourage you all to take a look at that when you can get a chance. While a third set, it sets up a learning environment and a structured approach towards building processes for consultation and participation across the expected outcomes, bulleted here in this table here on the slide for consultation and participation. How do we want to achieve that? So it was really an organization bringing a lot of people to a classroom, and a bit of brainstorming, but a bit of bringing in tools to organize themselves around what they need to do. So speaking of consultation and worker participation and new ways of communicating, I'm really excited to share with you on screen here is an example from some folks I audited only a few weeks ago at a BAE Systems location. It's a military equipment manufacturing operation in the southeast of the United States. It's a thing called the SLAM board, and the SLAM board is in each station along an assembly line. If you could imagine it's a military vehicle manufacturing facility. But at each one of those workstations, there's different things going on, and their environment changes constantly every day. What they're doing, there's some regularity to it for sure, but there is certainly constant change. What they do at each shift is they visit this SLAM board. You can see critical risks. You can see some of the controls that are in place and any kind of special things that are going on that day. It's really neat because it's a situation where employees are asked to mention hazards, risks, and controls that they will apply to normal and unusual activities in their area. Now, what I really like about this is while there's often someone that would lead the charge, that person that grabs that dry erase marker. You know who they are in your workplace crowd. You might call them leaders. You might call them people who like attention, but they'll often take that charge. Either way, the conversation is happening, and employees are engaging in a dialogue, a real-time dialogue right there on the shop floor about the risks in front of them that day. What I really like about this is, and I told them, I said, there are followers in that crowd, those that you might call them introverts. You might call them amongst the many people that I know who may be neurodivergent. They kind of fall back. But when you have some of those people reach for that dry erase marker, and the day that they reach out and they lead this conversation, because it's a few weeks down the road, now you've got everybody on board, everyone with a capital E. And now you've got a workplace culture. You know that those people can talk amongst each other because they did so in some small setting here. So it's very powerful example that I just wanted to throw out there as, you know, a new old approach, you know, a flipboard and a dry erase marker, so to speak, that goes on every day. So just a neat kind of example. Next slide, please. And finally, our third example, emergency preparedness and response, is something that is, again, the landscape is changing around you. If you don't know that, reach out to those around you that provide services in any capacity during, in preparing for and responding to emergencies. Certainly, you know, some of the relationships with external providers, they've changed. So that's something that we really want to focus on in emergency preparedness and response. You have 5 different measures of preparedness and response that I threw out here. Certainly you want to make sure that any comprehensive program for emergency response addresses all 5 of them. You know, in the modern world, there seems to be more kinds of ways in which emergency conditions emerge. You know, we're well beyond the classic fire, first aid, and spills that we all get trained on as OHS personnel responsible for the well-being of a workforce. There are things like sabotage. There are various intruders, employees with a mental health issues that could turn uncomfortable to begin with, potentially violent as an extreme, and then many social factors that affect the workplace, but really shouldn't. And the list goes on. A great one I think of is with increasing frequency and ferocity for weather events in many global regions. Considerations for climate change into emergency planning has become more commonplace with many organizations. I mentioned off the air about the example of visiting the Northeast of the United States on audits where employees in their emergency planning have training for tornado sheltering there. I grew up in the region many years ago and have no recollection of anyone mentioning the word tornado. It was something that was a Midwest US phenomenon that perhaps you'd experience, but you know, with climate change, some of those weather-related events become escalated, exacerbated. They're a different volume than they once were, and we've got to plan accordingly. So certainly emergency preparedness and response needs to address some of that. And that's something, some of what, if we go back to the context, organizational investors, shareholders, other interested parties really want to understand. The stakes have risen because if it doesn't go right, you show up pretty quickly in the news and every other social media platform. So, so our relationship with first responders has changed. You think about reestablishing networks and testing cooperatives against those needs, and any programming for response needs to regularly communicate with these important external interested parties. Are they on your list in the context of the organization? What about the willingness of your people to train and perform as internal first responders? We mentioned about engagement and participation, and this is a classic example. Are they continuing to be interested in engaging in that emergency response role, which is often a voluntary ask for people? So lots of changing landscape. We use that word too much in this past hour, but if you go to the guidance document, once again, there are a couple of examples. The first one that they provide is where a client or an organization really focused in on one event. Earthquakes is the one that they focused on. They brainstormed, likely based on some experience, on all the immediate and long-term considerations and outcomes they need to face in continuing providing a safe workspace after a sudden unanticipated event like that. So they dialed in on one and went full bore on it. In the second example in the guidance document, there's a long-term emergency, and there's a concern in developing an issue with Legionella in poorly operating cooling towers. And the issue here is an evolving and long-term response to a condition. We've all become experts at this through our individual and workplace responses to COVID-19 over the past few years. You want to talk about an emergency condition that hung around way too long in all of our personal interests. So it's very timely that that example was included. While corrective and preventive actions for equipment, in this case the Legionella, are clearly defined and they're near-term actions, workforce and workspace conditions will require time to remediate and cure that workforce if there are people affected by it. So it's a great example of a need to have a sustained and long-term response program for one of your emergency scenarios. So both of these really do a good job of taking those 5 elements here in the slide and considering them in very different scenarios. So I hope that, taking a look at a couple of these, taking a deeper dive on a few of the clauses, opens the dialogue, and you can take that back within your organizations. Take a look at all of the examples that the guidance document provides across all the various clauses of 45,001, and appreciate that there's a need for a lot of new thought. I'll turn this over to you, Louise. I think we have another poll question.
That's right. Thank you very much, Bill. So before we start the Q&A, we'd like to ask you just one more poll question, please. So will your organisation be looking for any of the following assurance services in the next 12 months? So ISO 45001 gap analysis, ISO 45001 certification, training, integrated management systems audit, or other assurance services. So those options again are ISO 45001 gap analysis, certification, training, integrated management systems audit, or other. I'll just give a few more seconds for people to take part. So thank you very much for your participation in the polls today. And I think we can end it there just so we can move on to the Q&A. Make sure we can get through as many questions as possible. So quite an even split there. So thanks again for taking the time to take part in the polls, and it's now our turn to answer your questions. So as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Martin, our first question is for you. You describe this as a guidance standard, but does its publication in any way adjust what is expected of an organisation wishing to be certified to ISO 45001?
Well, I know we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll try and keep my answers short on these, Louise. And the short answer to this is it doesn't change anything. 45001 provides the requirements. It's a self-contained standard, and conformity to 45001 is not affected by the publication of 45002. 45002 is there to help and to make suggestions and recommendations, but they are only that, and assessment to 45001 in whatever form, first, second, third party, should be based on 45001 alone.
Thank you, Martin. So the next question, do assessors and regulators look at effectiveness rather than compliance? This is a question from Derek. In his experience, they do not. So I don't know if we've got both sides of the
I'm out in the
assessment.
field, yeah, sure. I'm out in the field regularly auditing, as is my team at LRQA. We are looking for effectiveness. If something is not effective, it's not best achieving that conformity. So absolutely, the word effectiveness regularly shows up in our statements of nonconformities when we raise findings. The process was not effective. I think Martin made a mention of that early on in the hour. So yes, definitely effectiveness. Is your system controlling the risks in your mind and in your organization's kind of level of risk, tolerance for risk that you want to take on.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, and I just quickly add, Louise, if I may, it's been my experience too, with a different certification body as it happens, but certainly, I've seen challenges around, the system is not achieving, or that process is not achieving its fundamental objective, and this happened to be the example I was quoting. You've got a corrective action process, but you're still having exactly the same kind of incidents. There's something wrong. So I can attest that it does happen. I can't prove it always happens, of course, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate topic for discussion. In any audit is, are we focused there on the right thing, which is effectiveness? And I say the right thing because I'll just make this quick point. People often talk about, oh well, standards. The focus is on compliance, and it shouldn't be. Read the standard. ISO 45001 only uses words like compliance and conformity when it talks about compliance with the law and the things you as an organization have committed to comply with. But littered through the standard is the word effectiveness or effective. So when you're complying with the standard, you are supposed to be able to demonstrate that your processes are effective. So any test of compliance to the standard has to be a test of the effectiveness of the processes. It's written into the text, and so I just want to make that point. It's not that we're just sort of choosing to say it would be nice if we all focused on effectiveness. No, it's what the standard tells you.
Great. Thank you. So the next question we have is from Sharon. She said, we already have a risk system in place. It's handled mostly by our wonderful HSE and facilities manager. Is it better to have an expert that can take care of all aspects and has oversight of everything, or a team that have set areas of responsibility? They're a small company and expanding, and they don't want to lose sight of anything if somebody's away and if something happens. Do you have any advice for that situation?
Shall I jump in? I'm not sure who you want to direct the questions
Sorry,
to.
Martin.
Do tell
Yes,
us if
Martin.
you do,
Yes.
Louise. But I think it's great to have somebody with expertise, and especially in a small organization, make full use of them, but recognize the vulnerability as well, of the fact that person may not always be available, whether that's holiday, whether it's sickness, whatever it is. And also, I think, recognize that the standard encourages worker participation, and it's about, management systems are about building capability in organizations to do things, and particularly in an expanding small business, you need that capability to be expanding with the business. So I think there's a real opportunity to get, at least another person alongside who's going to act as the deputy. But there's perhaps even more of an opportunity to get people involved more in the participation in the risk assessment process, so they get more appreciation of it. And the other thing is, no matter how good any risk expert is in going around and assessing other people's areas of work, there's no substitute for having the people who do the work involved in and contributing to the risk assessment, because actually work as done is often not quite the same as work as imagined or work as described in a procedure, and that's what you capture when you involve the people who actually do the particular task in question.
Yeah, it's a great explanation. I think case in point with that slam board example, the worker's going to show up, a crew is going to show up on shift. They're going to go through that exercise in short order. It becomes part of their everyday business. They don't need the HSE person. In fact, the HSE people, that's what they love about it, is they've stepped aside from having to walk the floor with a copy of their JHA or other thing in their hand. No, the workforce is doing this, not management, not HSE. The workforce is doing this because they've discovered that it's relevant and important to them, and HSE moves on to the next task on their very long list.
Thank you, Bill. I think that leads in well to the next question from Natalia. So she's asked, how do you prevent 45,001 becoming a two-tier system with people who have access to a PC system and those manual workers who do not?
Well, that's good. It's all about technology. People may or may not have computers, but I'm pretty certain everybody that shows up to work anywhere has a cell phone in their pocket and has access to electronic media. And we've seen a lot of organizations come up with new and innovative ways of engagement with the workforce in many tools that also have that mobile app version to it. So when I talk about technology, boy, I've seen some things come out of the woodwork with people using mobile technology to be part of the solution. Doing an observation tour, a safety observation tour of a department, they take out a mobile phone and an app and they click through some radio buttons and hit submit. So the notion that they don't have PCs in front of them, that's waning away that defense, I would think.
And it's also part of the organization context, which you need to be thinking about in setting up the system in the first place. So yes, take all advantage possible of the technology that Bill describes and that changing situation, but also make sure you haven't designed a system that disenfranchises people, some group of people completely.
Yeah.
Change the system to something which involves more personal contact with those individuals in the relevant, areas of the relevant parts of the system if necessary. That's what the context clause is really, trying to encourage you to think about.
Sure.
Brilliant, thank you. So Martin, this next one's for you. Has any research been carried out which demonstrates that workplaces that implement ISO 45001 are safer than those that do not? And that's a question from Stuart.
Well, it's a great question, and I'm pleased that only as a result of some fairly recent work I can answer that question positively and say yes, there has been some work of that kind which does demonstrate exactly that, namely that, well, two things in fact. Organizations that choose to certify to well, in fact, it's to a health and safety management system standard. I should be careful here. It's not actually 45,001 because that's too new off the block. It was done on the basis of the 18,001 standard, but those who know the two will know how similar they are, and so I think we're entitled to do some extrapolation. So yeah, organizations which apply an OHS management system based on in fact OSAS and certified to it were demonstrated statistically when compared to a matched peer group to be better performing at OHS before they became certified, interestingly. So that tells us that certification appeals to organizations which have already been investing more in this area. But what the research also showed was that those organizations that were certified subsequently improved their performance more than a matched peer group which were not certified. Now, this is research that was carried out by Harvard and Duke universities in the US, and I should put the caveat to it that it is specific to the US, where there was access to regulatory information that is statutorily required to be submitted by organizations to regulators on their OHS performance. And so it was possible to match this data with the data on which of those organizations was or wasn't certified. There are not that many countries in the world where that can be done, unfortunately, just because of the access to reliable data. But I'm hoping that we will see some further studies done along those lines in countries where it is possible, because it's an important result and people are entitled to raise that question. You know, can you prove this works? And the evidence, you know, the limited evidence there is, but it is very positive, I'm pleased to say.
So we're nearly out of time, so I'll just try and squeeze a couple more in. So Bill, I've had somebody ask, how long does it typically take an organisation to gain ISO 45001 certification?
Well, it's a very popular question, and the answer is how long it takes you to get organized, and the level of commitment that you have. You know, I hate to throw a number out there. I would caution, try not to go too swiftly. You know, we do certification work for organizations, and sometimes we find people are just too quick out the gate to get that certification. And then we hit them with a lot of non-conformities that they probably wouldn't have had, but now it pushes them back a little. It actually slows them down. So, you know, the time frame, it all depends on your organization, quite honestly. So I hate to throw a number. Many can do it in a year to 2 years. To think that you're going to do it in 90 days, I don't think so.
Okay, and let's just try and squeeze one last one in before we have to. How would you advise demonstrating evaluation of legal compliance for 45001? Bill, can you take that one?
How would you demonstrate evaluation of compliance? There are a great many ways in which organizations do that very task. There's things that it all depends on the level of risk and the level of compliance. I've seen organizations where they've had to put something of a greater frequency, more of an observational, more of an inspection than it is of a periodic audit of what is it that we need to comply with and how do we do it, and are we effective at doing that. So those evaluations of regulatory compliance, they can vary. There are second parties that are brought in at times, depending on the level of capability and availability. A lot of organizations are leaning down in their oversight and administrative functions. Unfortunately, it's going to include, you know, health and safety organizations and their ability to resource it. That willingness I just talked about. You know, oftentimes you've relied on some good people from the floor to do quality and/or safety observation audits. Are they still available? So I think you really need to look at, can I continue to be effective with whatever evaluation of compliance measure I have in place right now, versus what I might need to be doing going forward.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. We've gone past the hour. So thank you to Martin and Bill, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you'd complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within the next few days with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. So on behalf of LRQA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.